I'm Leah.
And I'm Stede, and together we're gals, gays and theys. We make video essays on queer culture, past and present.
Today we're talking about Our Flag Means Death, the historical pirates who inspired the show, and the golden age of Sodomy.
I think you mean the golden age of piracy.
Nope, I really don't. In 2022, Stede and I stumbled upon the HBO Max show Our Flag Means Death. The show tells the story of Stede Bonnet, a wealthy landowner who abandons his life to become a pirate. We were drawn in by the many, many gay characters. An embarrassingly short amount of time later, we'd finished the first season.
Of course, Our Flag Means Death isn't the first gay pirate story out there. Sailors and pirates have always been associated with queerness, and stories about romance among pirates are as old as pirates themselves.
These days, there are shows like Black Sails and books like A Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue. But in the barren wasteland of the early 2000s, the closest we got to a gay pirate was Captain Jack Sparrow.
The performance of Sparrow was inspired by Keith Richards, and though this eyeliner-wearing drunken captain seemed a little fruity, no one wants to look at his crusty dreadlocks. Here's a clip of a church play where Jack Sparrow is a metaphor for Jesus instead.
Though there are a ridiculous amount of academic articles written about Sparrow's queer coding, we're not really interested in the theme park tie-in. The gayest thing about Pirates of the Caribbean is the way that Keira Knightley made me feel as a child.
There's a reason Our Flag Means Death is the show that we're going to be talking about today, and it's not just because it's the one that I like best. Despite being based on real people, the show feels distinctly ahistorical. I mean, come on, he's a leather daddy.
For lovers of historical fiction, this might feel like a dumbing down of the genre. The show's writers didn't hesitate to alter the life of Stede Bonnet in whatever way seemed most convenient, but neither did the people who wrote his history in the first place. Most of what we know about pirates of this time comes from legends and folktale, not eyewitness accounts.
Pirates rarely wrote things down, and stories about them were openly fictionalized. Much of what we know about Stede Bonnet and Blackbeard comes from the 1724 document, A General History of Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates. In this partially fictionalized work, legend and fact are treated as one and the same.
We know little about the author of this document, who went by Charles Johnson, but was probably named Daniel Defoe. But when you think about it, he wasn't all that different from the creator of Our Flag Means Death, David Jenkins. Inspired by the very basic facts of these pirates' lives, they both created their own context.
Bit of fan fiction. Captain Bonnet, can't stop imagining him in all different scenarios, all totally made up.
In this video, we'll be avoiding any spoilers, but we will be discussing plot details that mirror real-world events. At the time of recording, only season 1 of the series had been released, so please don't harass us about not including your favourite scene from the newest episode.
The show begins in 1717, when Stede Bonnet was a wealthy landowner in the British colony of Barbados. Like all British colonists, he and his family had strong New Zealand accents.
Which is your favourite of all the horses?
I like Arthur. He has kind eyes.
He abandons his family pretty much immediately, just like the real Stede Bonnet did. And just like the real Stede Bonnet, he bought a ship called the Revenge and became the Gentleman Pirate.
Polite menace. That'll be my brand.
A general history says that he was no sailor and suffered for want of a competent knowledge in maritime affairs. In the show, he's kind of a bumbling girl boss. Despite his poor reputation, it seemed the real Stede and his 70-person crew were able to take over a few ships.
In Our Flag Means Death, it only takes 15 quirky characters to sell the Revenge, but my favourite is non-binary pirate Jim. But honourable mention to Aluwande and Frenchie.
In the show, and in reality, Stede had an unfortunate run-in with the Spanish. While he's out of commission, the ship is taken over by Blackbeard, otherwise known as the Bristol-born pirate Edward Teach. Unlike Bonnet, Teach did not grow up rich, and so we know basically nothing about his life before this.
The author of A General History had a lot of fun with Blackbeard, making sure to remind us all that he was a most cruel, hardened villain, bold and daring to the last degree. At the time, he was captaining a former slave ship that he renamed the Queen Anne's Revenge. With 40 guns and a crew of 300, it was notable for more than just their amazing flag.
As the superior in roguery,
Lever Daddy.
it was a given. Sorry. It was a given that Blackbeard would take control of the Revenge. Bonnet was laid aside, notwithstanding that the sloop was his own.
Stede and Ed spent much of the first season growing closer and occasionally finding time to be pirates. In 1717, it's believed that Bonnet and Teach actually sailed together for a few months before separating in December. During this time, Bonnet allegedly grew to regret his piracy, and we see that doubt reflected in the show. A General History explains he was confounded with shame when he thought upon what he had done, and he would gladly leave off that way of living.
Bonnet's regret is not what I'd call convincing. Season 1 of the show leaves off around this point in Stede's story, but in the real world, Bonnet was offered a pardon to work as a privateer against the Spanish. He took the offer, but he was back to pirating within a year.
Meanwhile, Blackbeard and his flotilla were only growing more notorious. In 1718, they blockaded the port of Charlestown, South Carolina, and plundered 9 vessels attempting to sail out the harbor. They were seeking not money, but medicine.
Teach told 2 pirates and a prisoner to share his demands with the town. When they didn't return, his crew made the people of the colony regret it. They terrorized the area until medical supplies were provided. If only everyone with medical debt could do the same today.
You're gonna get us put on a watch list.
Yeah, it didn't work out that well for Blackbeard either. His increased notoriety intensified the search for him. The Queen Anne's Revenge was grounded in South Carolina, where it was actually found in 1996. Unfortunately, no billionaires have taken a shoddy submarine down to visit it yet.
Blackbeard and his crew shifted to a series of smaller ships. After a lifetime of piracy, he was confronted and killed in November 1718.
Allegedly, he was shot at least 5 times and received over 20 blade wounds. This should give you a pretty good idea of just how truthful these legends are. With that said, we are pretty sure that the British displayed his hand on their mast and hung all but 2 of his crew.
Bonnet didn't last much
Sorry,
longer.
your little, so interesting.
I mean, it is. Bonnet didn't last much longer. He went back on his promise to serve the crown, and officials hung him in December 1718, after only 2 years of piracy.
You think you could last longer?
No? Do you?
I mean, kinda.
You're very wrong.
We should probably explain what time period we're talking about when we're talking about piracy. There have been pirates in many cultures, across many time periods, and there are still pirates today. But we're discussing the golden age of piracy, which lasted from approximately the 1650s to the 1730s. To put that into perspective, Mickey Mouse is 15 years older than this so-called age.
Oh, wow. We're specifically talking about the period from 1715 to 1726, when the end of the War of Spanish Succession left many men unemployed. Murder was nothing new to these white men, and piracy was the natural next step in their careers.
During this time, around 5,000 pirates were said to be at sea. To put that into perspective, that's around the same amount of people who attended Firefest. And like Firefest, it was not fun for white people, but it was really bad for the people of the Caribbean.
The golden age of piracy is inseparable from colonialism. It's great that pirates stole wealth from the empire, but that doesn't mean wealth was being returned to the people who'd been exploited in order to create it.
Indigenous groups like the Taino were slaughtered by the new colonists, and slaves were being bought and sold at the same ports where pirate ships docked.
The colonies at the time were overwhelmingly made up with men, both white and black. In Sodomy in the pirate tradition, author B.R. Burg explains that sexual interactions between men was fairly commonplace at that time in the colonies. It was even acknowledged by pirates' contemporaries.
Stede Bonnet was from Barbados, and so was Thomas Waldock, a colonial official who wrote, "All Sodom's sins are centered in thy heart. Death is thy look, and death in every part. Oh, glorious isle, in villainy excel. Sins to the height, thy fate is hell."
Are we allowed to say sodomy on YouTube? Will that get us demonetized?
Probably. Oh well.
They were allowed to say sodomy in 1655. Colonist Margaret Heathcourt wrote to her cousin, "They've all a company of Sodomites that live here."
If there had been more women in the colony, I'd have told her to stop complaining and get with the gay agenda. Of course, these people didn't see themselves as gay. The identity category didn't exist yet, but the act certainly did.
Pirates were people living and working outside of dominant society, and the lifestyle attracted people who didn't fit into what Burg calls the heterosexual milieu.
In this apartment, we're bad at accents and mean to the French.
Yes. At the time, only a third of English seamen were involved in ocean-going trade. These traders spent years at a time at sea with no women and no ability to form a family. If I was a closeted gay man, that's the kind of life I'd like to lead.
At the very least, it'd be better than the Navy. Many pirates were men who were pressed into service, but wanted to avoid the poor conditions on the Crown's ships.
Me and Jim, we don't do this because we like it. We do it because we don't have any other choice.
The British Navy was pillaging too, but the average soldier got a smaller cut than the average pirate.
There was also a lot of children on pirate ships. At the time, many young boys were forced out of the house as early as 12. This resulted in roving gangs of English children wandering the countryside, robbing people.
I feel like you and your friends would have had a lot of fun with that. If you didn't have to be violent.
Piracy is clearly the better alternative. The presence of children on these ships brings up troubling questions about consent, and almost certain there are abusive relationships between boys and men. That's way too big of an issue for us to go into today, but we wanted to be sure that we mentioned it.
Pirates of this time are often represented as white, but white Europeans were not the only people at sea. There's no way to get actual statistics on the racial makeup of pirates at the time, but it's generally believed that there were a lot of black pirates, both free and enslaved. On some ships, black pirates were allowed to vote, got equal share of the booty, or were even elected captains.
One example is Lawrence de Graff, an escaped slave who went on to lead a fleet that peaked at 2,000 men. The existence of a black buccaneer terrified contemporaries and the historians that followed them. Afraid he would inspire rebellion among slaves, they depicted him as a blonde man with blue eyes. In this act of historical erasure, we see how pirates challenged the existence of white supremacy and capitalism, and how stories of pirates have been rewritten to minimize their radical potential.
History is written to naturalize the power imbalances in the present, so we can't pretend that our visions of the past are objective. Because marginalized people are, marginalized, they rarely make it to the pages of history books. People love to say that we're reaching when we discuss the presence of racial, gender, and sexual minorities on pirate ships, but it's far less realistic to imagine that all of history looked like this.
Of course, not all black pirates were treated well. When pirates captured slaves, some would offer them freedom. Others would just enslave them again. Blackbeard had black people on his ship, including a Negro boy that he raised with considerable care.
Wow!
I think it's sus.
It's important to note that both Bonnet and Teach owned slaves. We are not big fans of representing slave owners in a positive light, and we'll talk about what this means for the show in our next video. But long story short, it's an issue.
Man for sale! Man for sale! Healthy, sturdy.
Captain.
While the colourblind crew of Our Flag Means Death doesn't necessarily reflect reality, pirates were friendly to free black people. At least, as friendly as everyone else was at the time. A super high bar, I know.
When people talk about pirates, they often talk about violence.
Traditionally, piracy is a culture of abuse. Floggings, keel haulings. And my thought is, why?
You're a killer, bro. You're a fucking killer. So kill.
And it's true that pirates killed many, many people. They raped people too, particularly black and indigenous women. But you know who else was doing that? the entire English society from which these men were fleeing.
For some reason, we don't talk about how brutal and cruel the British Navy was. Instead, novels like Jane Austen's Persuasion represents British soldiers as noble adventurers taming a wild land. Neither of us are denying that pirates were violent. But what were they doing that the British weren't?
In our society, violence is almost always represented as interpersonal. A burglar who shoots someone is seen as more violent than a politician who signs the order to kill civilians in Afghanistan. Pirates committed violence against individuals, but the colonies represented a far worse form of violence against entire civilizations.
European violence led to a system of racist heteropatriarchy that still plagues us to this day. Our hot take is that this happy, smiley representation of society built on the eradication of indigenous people and the enslavement of black people is a lot more violent than this.
Pirates certainly contributed to colonialism, but they also sometimes threw a wrench in the work. So now that we've established that pirates hurt people, let's consider whether they were actually as brutal as the stories say they were. Many historians claim their crimes were vastly overreported. But more importantly, we can't make universal statements about a group this diverse. Just like it wouldn't be fair for us to say that all Disney adults are annoying.
I think that's fair.
I guess. Okay, well, the point is, each ship was an island, and they all had their own rules. Pirates wrote up articles which detailed how booty was shared and sometimes included codes of conduct. They tended to be more egalitarian than how prizes were shared on merchant and navy ships.
In what little records we have, we see evidence of prohibitions against fighting, stealing, and meddling with women and boys due to their disruptive influence.
I am disruptive.
Burg explains that some ships also forbade rape. Aboard the Revenge, commanded by pirate John Phillips, the crew adopted as one of their regulations: if at any time we meet with a prudent woman, that man that offers to meddle her without her consent shall suffer present death.
John Phillips said no means no. In these codes, we see plenty of examples of pirates seeking to build a kinder society. You know what we don't see?
Codes prohibiting sodomy?
Exactly.
There was no evidence that pirates disapproved of sodomy in their ranks. There were even examples of romantic relationships between men being codified.
Burg discusses matelage, or modelage, or matelage. It doesn't really matter. But matelage involved the institutional linking of a buccaneer with another male. Sharing property was a fundamental feature of matelage, and if one partner died, it was understood that the other would get his effects.
The pirate George Rounceville and his friend were one example of matelage that went well beyond an economic partnership. When his friend was trapped on a sinking vessel, he jumped into the water and swam to the vessel and there perished with his friend since he could not save him.
Where's that film adaptation? That could be the next Brokeback Mountain.
No, there's not nearly enough self-hatred.
Fair enough.
And now it's time to talk about my favourite pirate from Our Flag Means Death, Jim. At the start of the series, Jim pretends to be a man in order to avoid the ire of another pirate. With that said, they're clearly meant to be non-binary, and they/them pronouns are used for them throughout the entire show.
So, let's talk about gender diversity on pirate ships. Truthfully, there's not a ton of evidence of it. In A General History, we meet Mary Read and Anne Bonny, the most famous female pirates in history. Unfortunately, this document is the only place where we hear them mentioned, which indicates they're probably fictional. But they could still be inspired by real people.
And I don't know if we'd consider them women today. A General History states that Mary Read's mother raised her as a boy, and she continued to live as a man when she became a pirate at 13.
Bonny and Read both chose to dress and live as men, and to us, that's enough to mark them as a gender outlaw. Their queerness is emphasized in the story of how they realized they were both women. From A General History.
Her sex was not so much as expected by any person on board, till Anne Bonny, who was not altogether so reserved in point of chastity, took a particular liking to her. In short, Anne Bonny took her for a handsome young fellow, and for some reason best known to herself, first discovered her sex to Mary Read. Mary Read, knowing what she would be at, and being very sensible of her own incapacity that way, was forced to come to a right understanding with her, and so to the great disappointment of Anne Bonny, she let her know she was a woman also. But this intimacy so disturbed Captain Rackham, who was the lover and gallant of Anne Bonny, that he grew furious with jealousy, so that he told Anne Bonny he would cut her new lover's throat. Therefore, to quiet him, she let him into the secret also.
Captain Rackham clearly thought Reed's sex was an obstacle to any relationship with Bonny, but we're not so convinced. Even if this story is completely made up, this is a great example of how powerfully queerness and piracy were linked. And let's not assume that Rackham was straight just because he was allegedly sleeping with Bonny. He was also known as Calico Jack, who you might recognize from Our Flag Means Death. In my opinion, they did him a little dirty in the show with his all-brown outfits. Calico Jack was actually known for dressing quite brightly and, well, foppishly. This story also depicts two women on the same ship, implying that they might not have been as rare as we once believed.
And while there isn't much evidence of Bonny and Reed's existence, there is evidence that cis men weren't the only ones minking out onto pirate ships. In one article from a pirate ship, they said, if any man were found seducing any of the latter sex and carrying her to sea disguised, he was to suffer death. If women were never sneaking out to sea, why would you need a rule against it?
We can't project our modern understanding of gender onto the past. Given how few women were in the colonies in the first place, there were probably very few at sea. And all pirates were considered men at the time, regardless of what may have been their sex at birth. It's feasible that people lived and died as pirates without ever having their true sex revealed to their contemporaries or to history. We can't dig through their graves to check because, well, they're not that well documented and the ocean makes it kind of difficult. Still, it's worth considering what the appeal of piracy would have been to women and trans people at the time. It seems like a pretty big one.
So let's get to what everyone is waiting for. We know there were lots of pirates engaging in sodomy, but is there historical evidence that Teach and Bonnet were?
So what's going on between you two? You buggering each other or what?
There's no reason to believe they were hooking up with each other, but there's plenty of reason to think they were hooking up with someone. First, let's talk about Blackbeard. He was described as both dangerous and kind of queer.
His beard was black, which he suffered to grow at an extravagant length as to breadth. It came up to his eyes. He was accustomed to twist it with ribbons and small tails and turn them about his ears, and he struck a lightened match under his hat, which appeared on each side of his face. His eyes, naturally looking fierce and wild, made him altogether a figure that imagination cannot form an idea of fury, from hell to look more frightful.
The matches in his hat are iconic. I mean, he's the inventor of the fog machine.
You know, assuming any of this is true.
So you're saying Blackbeard's head is made of smoke?
God. This is what they think I look like. Hmm? Fucking Viking vampire clown with... Look at that. There's 1, 2, 9 guns all over him. 9 guns?
It's too...
I have 1 gun and 1 knife. Just like everyone else.
But Blackbeard's ribbons aren't why we think he was a man who loved other men. According to Burg, the failure of Blackbeard as a concubine lover was well known. It became part of a ballad. How did I mispronounce that one?
It's connubial, but I don't even know what that means.
Connubial? Are you kidding me?
The point is there's a ballad about how gay he is. When the Act of Grace appeared, Captain Teach and all his men unto the Carolinas steered, where they used him kindly then. There he married to a lady, and give her 500 pounds. But to her he proved unsteady, for he soon marched off the ground.
There's many signs of queerness in this little ballad. First off, it says he gave her money to marry him, when dowries were meant to come from the woman's family. Unsteady implies defective performance, and inability to complete his husbandly duties. When they say soon marched off the ground, they weren't implying departure, but failure, like he was being driven from the battleground.
Now, Stede Bonnet's story includes even more explicit references to queerness. In the second edition of A General History, the author had this to say about why Bonnet decided to become a pirate.
As he was generally esteemed and honoured before he broke out into open acts of piracy, he was afterwards rather pitied rather than condemned by those that were acquainted with him. believing that this humour of going a-pirating proceeded from a disorder in his mind, which had been but too visible in him some time before this wicked undertaking, and which is said to have been occasioned by some discomforts he found in a married state.
I mean, piracy? You left me to be a pirate?
It's not you. It was me. I was just uncomfortable in a married state.
So, you're a rich guy with a disorder in your mind that makes you miserable in your heterosexual marriage. What better alternative than life at sea, surrounded by sodomites?
No wonder he kept coming back to piracy.
When we set out to make this video, we knew we wanted to talk about what it means to be a figure outside of history. Pirates were people, but more than that, they were legends, known by few and feared by many.
Like all historical figures, the closer each pirate was to power, the more evidence we have for their existence. A written record was a privilege few were afforded, and that's why we know much more about the gentleman pirate and his contemporaries, rather than the black men who fled slavery for pirate ships.
If history is a matter of interpretation, we'd prefer to interpret on the behalf of the oppressed. We'd rather expound on what little we know than continue to repeat the same stories of white men whose great deeds were made possible by the people they exploited.
We'd argue that our flag means death achieves this goal to a certain extent, but it also elevates historical slave owners to the role of protagonist. Ahistorical narratives like this show and Hamilton may look different than the histories we were taught in school, but they reinforce historical narratives by absolving individuals of responsibilities for the racist systems that we live with today.
We'll be discussing these issues further in our next video essay, The Girl Bossification of History. We'll look at how attempts to tell empowering stories can erase historical oppression. As Chidi mentioned, we'll be analyzing Hamilton and Our Flag Means Death, but we'll also be discussing present-day narratives, like Red, White, and Royal Blue.
As a fellow British-American couple, we'll explain why we find the politics of that book and movie positively nauseating.
Thanks for watching this video, and for joining us on our journey through queer culture, past and present. If you enjoy our content, please like, comment, and subscribe.
Wow, we're like real YouTubers now.
We made it. Okay.
That was great.
I think that sounds good. We did it.